overlooked, it's missed because we're just used to doing things the way that we've been taught to do them, and that's to treat Indigenous people in this country as less than, as extra, as unimportant, and that is not the spirit and intent of treaty. That is not partnership. That is not sharing for the benefit of all. And until we start to live that practically, both in our actions and our words, I think it will be difficult for reconciliation to happen.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Miranda, I'm really excited that we're going to have this conversation. Like, your website describes you as an Indigenous advocate and a community connector, a defender of the truth. And you're a real community force, I can tell. And it was so neat to just meet you randomly and see that we had so much in common and interest. And I wouldn't have thought we would now be doing a podcast, but I think this is going to be super interesting, and we're going to cover some topics I'm not the least bit familiar with. So I know I'm going to learn a lot. And I always like to start the podcast off by getting people to introduce themselves in a thorough way and just learn about your positionality and all those good things. So I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself to the podcast listeners.
Thank you so much. And I just do want to acknowledge that we very much met very randomly, both invited to a virtual kind of consultation, and that's how I love to meet people. The random things that our paths cross and we would have never otherwise met. So I'm grateful that you've kept the connection going. So my name is Miranda Jimmy. I'm a member of Thunderchild First Nation, which is on the Saskatchewan side of Treaty 6 in kind of the central part of the province. I grew up mostly in Cold Lake, which is in northeastern Alberta, and have made my home here in Edmonton for more than half my life now. So I guess it's home. I guess I stumbled into the work of kind of doing Indigenous relations more because of a journey to find myself and renew my connections to my home community and to my relations. And walking in those two worlds, the world that I was taught about, the world that colonization teaches us about our history and who we are, and then how much that's been challenged by the Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers and perspectives that have really challenged me to think about the world differently, and the opportunities that exist to reclaim some of our ways of knowing and integrate those into all types of colonial practice. And so, for the last 20 plus years, I've been working in community development, specifically around Indigenous relations, kind of bridging the gap between organizations, governments, businesses that have services or programs that are intended to serve or benefit Indigenous people, and then those communities who would like to infiltrate, advise, change those programs, and how is that information kind of transferred, translated, and integrated across that bridge between the two different ways of working.
Nice. And this is totally off topic, but I can't help right now wonder about how people in Edmonton feel about Game 4 coming up. I don't know if you have predictions. This won't be aired until the fall, so it might not age well, but do you have a thought on that? Or
So full disclosure, not a hockey fan, and I feel very much a fish out of water in our city right now. Last night was game three in a row losses in the Stanley Cup Finals, and just came from a meeting downtown. The downtown is draped in Oilers everything. And everyone's kind of hanging their heads in shame, trying to remain hopeful for Saturday night. But I just came from a meeting that was very much Oilers fans, and they were talking about let's at least get a game 6 so that they can come back to Edmonton at least one time. So there's not hope that we're winning the cup anymore. There's just hope for a game 6.
All right, let me try to get back on track because this is not a hockey podcast, but I imagine that Edmonton was under a lot of pressure right now, but given your geographic location as well, like maybe you could share with me more about the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, like what the organization looks like and your role in the organization.
Yeah, so my day job, I work for the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations, which represents 16 sovereign First Nations that were signatories to Treaty 6 in Alberta. And so member organizations are geographically spread throughout central Alberta. And Edmonton is kind of the heart of that. That's where our head office is. And that's where kind of the central urban hub is. When folks leave their community, they tend to come to Edmonton or surrounding communities for opportunities. So kind of the hub of Indigenous relations for this part of Alberta. And so the Confederacy is a political advocacy organization focused on those shared interests of those 16 member nations of what are the joint advocacy efforts of issues, challenges that they're facing that they need to have a united voice around, a united statement around, and then work with the other orders of government around problem solving and solutions. So our files vary from, fundamental rights and upholding the treaty rights, challenging legislation to making sure that we have our fair share in what was intended in the treaty around health, education, housing, and then kind of maybe emerging issues around like economic opportunities, procurement, and I think post TRC, living into that work of reconciliation. What does it mean to reconcile our history? What does it mean for truth telling and the work around residential schools and other emerging issues around impacts of child welfare and kind of these other social issues, justice. And so it's very broad, and we recognize the independence of each of the nations to advocate for their own unique needs as sovereign nations, but obviously a shared responsibility amongst the nations. And so I was originally hired in summer of last year, 2023, to work on a partnership that we have with the City of Edmonton, with Parks Canada, and jointly with the Métis Nation of Alberta around the possibility of the creation of a national urban park in Edmonton. So the City of Edmonton is one of our strongest allies in this work of Indigenous relations, and we've had a long-standing memorandum of cooperation and dialogue with the City of Edmonton around our shared responsibilities, and specifically as it relates to the land in which the municipality exists on and benefits from.
Yeah, and I think it was the Canada's National Urban Park Initiative that you and I then connected the dots on, and I all of a sudden had all kinds of questions about co-management and would it be like other national parks and so on. So that's what I'm really keen to learn about in our conversation, and just maybe at a high level, you could share more about Canada's National Urban Park Initiative, because I'm trying to visualize what that looks like. Like I'm used to remote northern parks, and I see park spaces when I travel to cities every now and then on corner lots and stuff like that. So I'm trying to visualize what this is going to look like in your territory.
Yeah, I think historically, national parks have had very detrimental impacts for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. It's the government of Canada coming into their territory, asserting control and rights over their traditional land, sometimes forced removal of communities, impacting harvesting and traditional rights on their territory. So that's kind of been the historic experience of Indigenous communities with Parks Canada, which is not a great relationship. In more modern times, I think Parks Canada has tried to work more closely with nations in territories where they operate, how to restore some of that land access and access to harvesting and traditional ways of stewarding the land. So that's kind of modern day. There is currently a national urban park just outside of Toronto. It kind of borders Toronto, Scarborough, Pickering, Rouge National Urban Park. And this was a partnership between neighboring municipalities and Parks Canada to protect an already existing parkland and provides a new framework in how that land is protected and programmed and what infrastructure exists in the park. And so the current Liberal government has made a mandate since the last election to create at least 5 new national urban parks following that similar model of Rouge National Urban Park, with the addition of the requirement that municipalities and Parks Canada work with a local Indigenous partner to create them. So I think currently there are 7 possible candidate sites across the country. I keep hearing stories of other municipalities popping up wanting to do it since the program has been running. And so Edmonton is one of those candidate sites. And so that's meant that Parks Canada has funded the municipality and the Indigenous partners to explore this idea of what would a national urban park look like in our territory, who would be responsible for it, where would it be located, what are the geographical or natural features that want to be included, what would access look like. So some kind of, every park is intended to be unique depending on what the local partners want it to look like. This is very much new territory for Parks Canada to think about co-creation of a space like this, which has not been their model previously. I don't want to speak on behalf of Parks Canada, but I think they are learning a lot about how complex it is working with partners who have different ideas, different expectations, different capacity levels for this work, and different expectations around the outcome and long-term vision for the park. You know, if you are normally the person in charge making all those decisions, it's really easy to move things forward quickly. When you've got multiple perspectives at the table, things move very slowly and can shift from the original conversation.
There's no doubt. And I've seen a lot of shifting happening with parks in my home area as well. And it can definitely take time, especially when there's multiple groups and regions at play. And you're talking about a confederacy and 16 different sovereign First Nations. So I can imagine that's going to be complicated to garner consensus. And is it too early days at this stage to ask if the Confederacy has a vision for what the park will look like, or is that something that's really clear already to you?
I think it is early days. So we're technically, as we stand today, as we talk about this conversation in mid-June, still in the pre-feasibility phase of the project. And so what that means is this idea even viable? That's the conversations we're having right now. And so viable from like the partners that are currently at the table. Is this the right partner group? Are there voices and perspectives that are missing? Are there, people who are at the table that shouldn't be? Who is bringing what to the partnership as far as resources, capacity, knowledge, expertise, funding? All of that's kind of still been sorted out before we can talk about even what the park could be or should be. One of the biggest challenges that we have as the Confederacy is we don't have a lot of skin in the game besides being rights holders. The funding is coming from Parks Canada. The landowner is the city of Edmonton. And so we're at the table because the program requires an Indigenous partner, but we're not providing dollars or land. So where we can influence the conversation is the land choice and the location going to benefit our nations? Are there other kind of benefits that could come from a long-term park arrangement, like employment opportunities or economic opportunities? Is there an opportunity for restoration of traditional site? or attention or programming to sites of historical significance? So these are all questions I think that will come up once we decide, is this even viable?
Yeah, and just curious about your interpretation of the land, because I would have. Does the Confederacy not see the land that Edmonton is on as their land, or?
Absolutely. So the site of most significance for folks who know Edmonton, the North Saskatchewan River runs southwest to northeast, cutting the city kind of diagonally. And so the Edmonton River Valley is historically significant to First Nations. It's our highway of travel. It is where nations from across Western Canada came to meet. The original Fort Edmonton is what created, present day settlement here. And so absolutely, this site is important to us. We see it as our land. And the city of Edmonton has relationships with multiple nations who claim this as their territory. So the Confederacy represents 16 of the 32 nations that the city recognizes the traditional territory of. So that's also a political space that we're navigating, as we want to recognize those other sovereign nations outside of the Confederacy who also claim this territory.
Okay, so it is more complicated than the 16, obviously. And forgive me, but again, where I said I'm more familiar with rural, the north. I haven't grown up in an urban setting. And for me, when I think of parks, or in my own home territory here in Labrador, I think of the animals. So caribou, polar bears, geese, moose, salmon, and char. And I'm just wondering, in this park, do you see animals as being central, and which ones? How will this look?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I want to also kind of help with the kind of placement of what we're talking about. So most of Edmonton's River Valley is already protected in some way. Most of it already is municipal or privately owned parkland. The Nature Conservancy of Canada has parcels of land, City of Edmonton. Most of it is protected with some sort of layers of protection, and also has pipelines and utility lines and utility accesses running through it. So those two things coexist, which is not necessarily how First Nations would choose to protect for or care for the land or the river valley. So this is kind of something we're inheriting, is decisions have already been made about parkland and land use and access and utility access and infrastructure building. So we're inheriting all of the decisions that have already been made. So the average person would visit Edmonton's River Valley and say, it's beautiful parkland. It's full of green space. There's natural trails. I see deer. I see beavers. I've seen a moose. I've seen hundreds of different kinds of birds. All of that is present. And if a pipeline ruptures, they're ripping it all up to solve that problem. So that, those two things coexist right now. And so again, thinking back to, so yes, this is our traditional territory. Yes, this is a place that we claim responsibility and stewardship for. And we are bound by decisions that have already been made that have disrupted how we would have chosen to care for or steward the lands that we're now being invited to the table to participate on conversations about.
Right. And with the whole idea of co-management of the different animals that are in that park, is the idea of co-management emerging in any discussions or vision, or again, maybe it's premature with the pre-feasibility stage, but I'm curious if co-management is starting discussion, or if the Confederacy is going to be going to something beyond that. I think that will be super interesting to hear.
Yeah, and so I want to preface that by saying Parks Canada is the extra partner to this conversation. So the City of Edmonton and the Confederacy of Treaty 6 have been having conversations about river valley protection and land use for decades. And so we've had a formal partnership and agreement to work together since 2012. And many of those projects have been based in River Valley development. So before there was talk of Edmonton being a national urban park, we were already directly involved with, consulted on, advising on all parts of land use in the River Valley. And so, in the last 20 years, I would say. And so Parks Canada is just a layer to that conversation. I actually think the strength of the partnership and the ability to advocate for co-management comes from our existing relationship with the City of Edmonton, rather than the mandate from Parks Canada to have an Indigenous partner at the table. So the City of Edmonton is currently, and has been for 3.5 years now, looking at modernizing their River Valley planning bylaws and land use. And so our nations have been directly involved in consultation around that, talking about a new co-management, co-governance model for decisions in Edmonton's River Valley. And so those decisions are ongoing. And in the next year, City administration will be making recommendations to City Council based on what they've heard from our First Nations to say this is what the plan should be going forward. So that's separate from any national urban park.
Right. So is there any early organizational structures being contemplated? I'm just thinking now about the 32 different nations that are relevant in the city of Edmonton. Is there any early conception of what that may look like from a co-management perspective?
I wouldn't say that there's any early agreement. There's recognition of complexity and perhaps some looming conflict. Again, because the Confederacy of Treaty 6 has a memorandum of cooperation and dialogue with the city, we have an existing agreement. All nations recognize that this is Treaty 6 territory. And so I would hope there's a bit of a recognition of and a responsibility to the Treaty 6 nations to actually be responsible going forward in partnership and in recognition of those other nations. So that's the stance I have as a staff member of the Confederacy. But I'm sure if you asked another nation, nations from Treaty 7, they might have a different opinion of what should happen going forward.
All right. So you already are getting used to diplomacy in this new role and whatnot. So I'm super curious to see how it will unfold. And as we're talking, it's just, I guess I'm realizing as well that many of my conversations on this podcast have been with people and that are in regions that are covered by modern day treaties and comprehensive land claim agreements. So it's probably a good idea just to back up a little bit and share with the audience a bit about Treaty 6 itself and how that looks and what the relationship is with the government of Canada in particular. And I'd be curious to learn. And I had a question that I was going to ask you anyway, because your emails all end with when you sign off in the spirit and intent of the treaty relationship. So I'm really curious just to hear your thoughts on Treaty 6 and what that relationship means.
Yeah, so I recognize that I am not a treaty historian in any sense of that. And so I speak from my perspective and what I've been taught so far. But I would say the numbered treaties as kind of a homogenous group are unique in Canada in that the terms of each of the numbered treaties were agreed to with the Crown. And, where I sit now in Edmonton in Treaty 6 territory, this place and the signing of treaty existed before the province of Alberta existed. It existed before Confederation, before this was a part of Canada. And so in thinking about it in those terms, I think it's important to think that every one of those agreements that came after, Treaty number 6 was the foundation to those being able to exist. That's our perspective. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the government of Alberta or even the government of Canada's perspective, but we try to remind our government partners in our conversations with them that Treaty 6 was an agreement that was made between the nations of this territory and the British Crown for the sharing of the resources of this land. And in practical present day application, I like to look at it and think about what does it actually mean to be in partnership? And I think that that partnership has proven itself to be very imbalanced. And so again, going back to the spirit and intent of treaty, it was about partnership. It was about working together. It was about sharing for the benefit of all, recognizing that First Nations had inherent rights as stewards and the original peoples of this land. And we welcomed the newcomers and agreed to work with them under certain terms. And those terms have not been upheld on the Crown side, on the government side. And so from a treaty perspective, as a descendant of a signatory to Treaty 6, I feel a responsibility to remind our treaty partners of that commitment that existed, that should be foundational to every discussion that comes since then. I also feel a responsibility to remind anyone who makes their home in Treaty 6 territory that they are also treaty partners, even though they didn't sign the treaty or are descendants of someone who signed the treaty. They are beneficiaries of that agreement. So for me, that is the spirit and intent of treaty that I try to demonstrate in how I act, how I interact, and how I amplify how treaty can be a pathway forward for the work of reconciliation if all sides are willing to start from that conversation of treaty and its intent.
Yeah, I guess when I reflect on what you're saying there's no doubt in our society people that are going to get that right away, and they're going to see themselves as treaty people. And I was curious about one of your blog posts where you've written about how to be an ally to Indigenous people, and I would see that closely aligned with being a treaty person and being an ally. And I think it'd be really interesting just to go over that blog with people and get your advice on what it means to be an ally and in practical sense how to go about it. Because I often meet people that are working in government and other places and definitely want to be allies, but also want practical advice on what they can do given such a complex history and so many complex issues to try to reconcile at this stage. But would love to hear your thoughts on being an ally.
I think for me, and honestly, I'm not sure which blog post you're pointing to when you talk. I like rattle off lots of things online, but I'll maybe summarize by saying that I think it is going back to that idea of treaty as partnership. And so I still think today that First Nations in Canada and in Treaty 6 are seen as sometimes stakeholders or special interest groups as opposed to sovereign governments that should be treated as equals, that require formal consultation, require formal dialogue, require equal treatment and equal say. And so to even fight for that to be recognized as a standard is a constant conversation I have. And so on an individual level, I think that if folks see themselves as allies to Indigenous issues, then I would say, what does that mean for practical terms for you? So whatever level of affluence or influence you have, all of us are connected to networks and groups of people that listen to and respect what we have to say. And so when you're in those conversations, when you're responsible for making decisions, always doing a gut check to two questions. One, is this impacting Indigenous people? And how are they involved in it? And so if they're not, like sometimes just using your voice and say, I'm noticing that perspective is missing from this table. I'm noticing that we're making decisions without a sovereign government that will be impacted by the decisions and the consensus of this group. So even raising that recognition, I think is a moral and legal responsibility that each of us have as Canadians. And it's overlooked, it's missed because we're just used to doing things the way that we've been taught to do them. And that's to treat Indigenous people in this country as less than, as extra, as unimportant. And that is not the spirit and intent of treaty. That is not partnership. That is not sharing for the benefit of all. And until we start to live that practically, both in our actions and our words, I think it will be difficult for reconciliation to happen.
When you're done listening to the podcast, please find some time to explore www.comanagement.ca, where we are compiling open access literature about co-management in Canada for you. We've also created an AI chatbot named Ocean. Ocean is trained on the open access literature that we've curated. So if you don't have time to read all the academic literature, you may just want to have a quick chat conversation or ask a specific question. And of course, there will be references. So if you want to then dive deeper, you can click on a link and check the sources and read the full article if you have time. So please enjoy, and your feedback on Ocean, the AI chatbot, is always welcome. And I wonder, too, now thinking about for people that are going to want to be allies of the park and this initiative going forward, and there's so much written and said about Indigenous knowledge systems in the co-management world, and I'm thinking about the Edmonton River Valley now and all the knowledge that there has to be about that particular territory. Does the Confederacy have a plan or approach on how that knowledge and those voices will be incorporated into the vision for the park? I think that would be really instructional and insightful for people that still struggle with trying to understand Indigenous knowledge and how to spend a lot of time trying to make it fit into systems where it doesn't belong to begin with, but how can they work with it type thing?
Yeah, so going back to kind of like my career, I've always been trying to build that bridge between folks who think they know and folks they want to serve. And, more directly with this role with the Confederacy, I've been really circling in on the environmental NGOs. So these are folks who live and breathe environmental conservation, preservation, environmental activism. And I've been trying to educate them on the treaty relationship over the last year to think about what does that look like and how they use their voice, how they apply their knowledge, how they enter into conversations, and who listens to them, and how are they working to include Indigenous ways of knowing, amplifying Indigenous perspectives in their work. And I would say, some are more receptive than others. And I think they can be great allies in this work because they have Western ways of knowing, they have technical knowledge, they have monitoring programs that could benefit and pair well with traditional knowledge systems. And so going forward, the way I've looked at the National Urban Park Project is whether the park happens or not, because we don't know if it will. This is an opportunity for the Confederacy and our 16 member nations to start thinking about what does partnership and practical application around environmental issues look like in an urban environment. And so how can we influence and change systems of land use planning, of open space planning, of protection, preservation, and conservation? And how can we start to cross-pollinate those ideas and knowledge systems from the Western ways of knowing and the traditional ways of knowing, again, in the spirit and intent of treaty, to work together in partnership for the benefit of all? And I think there are some very practical ways. I think I've said this before when I've been asked to speak with, I've done keynote speeches for some of these environmental groups. And I said, we talk about colonization as such detrimental impacts for First Nations people, for Inuit and Métis. The impacts of colonization in Canada as a colonial state have had detrimental effects on Indigenous people. But they've also had detrimental effects on the settlers who have continued to uphold this system. And the example I give is, imagine if, the spirit and intent of treaty was the basis for resource development in this country. It wouldn't mean that resource development never happened. It would just look different because we've been making decisions thinking more intently about the finned, the rooted, the winged relatives that we're responsible for, not just ourselves. We would think about migratory patterns of mammals and the health of the water and watersheds in how we planned our cities and our settlements. We would think about the impact of infrastructure projects when we chose sites, not for how does it benefit humans and the path of least resistance, but how does it impact the whole system. And so, I do think that we're dealing with a climate crisis now because the powers that be 200 years ago made a choice to go a certain path and didn't go the path of integration and taking knowledge systems together and melding them for the best result for everyone. They chose one path and excluded another. And so going forward, I would like to see more melding of those two paths when we think about we've inherited this space now because of decisions that have been made, and we can make different decisions going forward.
And forgive me if some of my questions they're definitely coming from my own mental model of what it's like living in the north and what a park looks like here. And I'm still like, for me, it's kind of a funny conversation because I'm struggling to get my mind around how things are similar yet so different. And one of the things that we worry about as well in certain circles is cultural continuity and making sure people stay connected to harvesting certain species or using certain lands. And I'm just wondering what that looks like from a traditional perspective in this modern time for the Confederacy, like whether it be the River Valley as travel or some other connections. But where does that fit in the priorities and help me visualize what that looks like?
It's funny, and I don't know enough about the listenership of who listens to your podcast, but your experience of living and working in the North. It's funny because I just came from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference, and Edmonton is considered the northernmost city in Canada, major city in Canada, and we're so far south geographically, but depending on your positionality and where you're listening from, Edmonton might be far north or it may be very far south. So, Edmonton itself is a population of just over 1 million people, and they're planning for growth of that to double in the next generation. And so it is an urban center, and it is also a service hub for Indigenous people from across Western Canada and across the Northwestern Arctic. So, Edmonton has, I think, second largest Inuit population south of the 60th parallel. And so even though it is Treaty 6 territory and there's traditional ways of knowing the land here, we are also home to Indigenous people from across Canada who also bring their own traditional knowledge and ways of knowing the land to this place. And for generations have also called it home. And so it's a bit of a melting pot as well. So, going back to the who's responsible for the land and how do you make decisions, it becomes really difficult when we're talking about whose traditional territory is it, who was the signatory to Treaty 6, or who has called this place home for as many generations as they've known. And all of those answers could be different. And, the Confederacy also represents nations that are fairly remote, are quite rural. Some of our communities have populations of only a couple hundred people and are several hours drive from any major center. So those complex issues that they're dealing with in their home community, or even positionality in relation to the city of Edmonton and decisions we're making here, they're also not cut and dry and very homogenous across our 16 nations. And so when we think about our relationship with the municipality of the city of Edmonton, we have to take into consideration the differences. We also have 4 different language groups within the Confederacy of Treaty 6. Those nations also have their own teachings around land use and what's important, the use of plants and animals in harvesting and approaches to that. So it even within our Confederacy and our membership, there's complexity. So thinking about the next generation and what what I envision, both as a resident of Edmonton, as a treaty person, as a signatory or a descendant of a signatory to Treaty 6. I hold all of those labels of utmost importance about. I also try to think about my own relationship to the land. I make time every day to visit our river valley and ravine system. And even in an urban environment where I drive a car every day, live in a single family house, all of those things that are like urban practices, I still can have a relationship to the land. I can still think about my actions and the impact it has on the land. I can think about, monitor, and track the differences that I see in the land, which I do in my local ravine. I've seen the changes over seasons. I've seen the impacts of drought. I've seen the impacts of flooding, and all of those need to be tracked and monitored in a way that I think I look at differently as a treaty person and as a responsibility and a steward to the land than, an urban planner might, than a oil engineer might. And so all of those kind of ways of knowing and being have to come together to make the best decisions we can for not only the protection and preservation of the land, but our collective responsibility to it. And I don't think that's different in an urban setting. I think it's just more complex.
Interesting. And just a quick question on your website, on your About page, there's a picture of you by a ravine. Is this the one that you're speaking of?
Yeah. Yeah, and the header on my website is also in the city of Edmonton. When I talk about the work of reconciliation, I often pull up that picture. It's also on my business cards and my letter mail return address stamps, because I think that place, that piece of land specifically for me is a symbol of reconciliation. So that specific site is Woodbend Natural Area, which is in the far southwest corner of Edmonton, just off of the river. And it was a traditional youth site. Medicines grow there. And it wasn't a traditional encampment site. In this small parcel of land are 4 distinct different landscapes. There are sand dunes, there's boreal forest, there's natural prairie, as well as spruce and pine, as well as poplar and birch stands, which don't often integrate together. And so in this small parcel of land, and historically has been a site of significance, settlement came, a huge chunk of the land was cleared for agriculture. And then about a generation ago, the protection of the area, because it is so interesting with all of the features of it, was protected as a natural area. And over the last generation, those animals and plants have returned naturally. And I think, to me, this is the example of reconciliation. It's like a distinct point in time where we recognize the way we've been doing things is not going well, and we need to think about doing things differently. We need to stop and pause and think about our relationship to the land. And the land will guide us. The land will return without human interaction and will teach us what we need to know about our relationship with it. And this isn't quick, easy work. It is intentional work, and it's generational work. And so, I talk about this site. It's a very small site, and it's also one of the sites that's being considered for the National Urban Park. And so I like to think of this as an example of, like, imagine if we just paused and actually reflected on what has got us to this point in history, and what do we want the next 200 years to look like, and what are we doing now to get us closer to that?
Nice. No, just through our conversation, I started off thinking about the city landscape and the Edmonton Oilers. And now through our conversation and the beautiful pictures on your website, I got a completely different concept of Edmonton and your homeland. So it's really great. I'll share all of this in the show notes and make sure people learn more about you and your advocacy work. And I hope people have enjoyed the podcast. I certainly have learned a lot. And before we end, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share with people your own podcast that you're working on and get people to check it out. I know you're working on it and stuff, but I'll let you explain more.
Well, I'll raise my hands to the universe and say, hopefully, by the time this airs, that there'll be something to share with everyone. I've been working on it for a few years now. Kisiwin, which means the missing in Cree. This also kind of relates to the conversation we've been having, because in an urban setting, everyone has relationships with physical land features or their favorite restaurant or the neighborhoods they know, and they have their own interaction and understanding and history and connection to those places. But someone can live in the same neighborhood and, based on their lived experience and their circumstances, have a completely different relationship in that same exact place. And so what I'm exploring is a difficult topic. It is the stories of 5 murdered Indigenous women in Edmonton. And these women I didn't know personally, but heard about their stories and the coverage of their stories through local media and was drawn to them specifically. And what I'm trying to challenge in the stories is, what we hear about them is the crime and the consequences of that crime, either their victim, them as a victim, or the court system dealing with the person accused of their murder. And we don't necessarily ever get to hear the story of those women, who they were, who they loved, what brought joy to their lives. And I'm trying to challenge the public narrative of how we remember those women and how we remember the places that they're connected to in our city. So one of those women was murdered in a local hotel, and it's a prominent hotel that millions of people drive by every day, and they may know it as a landmark. But when I drive by it, I think of her, and her family thinks of her. And that hotel is being taken down for a major infrastructure project and will no longer exist. And so how do we remember those stories, remember those individuals, if the physical places that they're connected to no longer exist in our consciousness? So for me, it's about the relationship to each other as co-citizens of a place, our understanding of how we relate to place, and then how we understand and know the experiences of others who are supposed to be our neighbors and friends.
No, it's going to be, like you said, is a very challenging topic, but I think with your work in that, you'll doing another amazing job of changing how people think of certain spaces and places in Edmonton, which is really all connected to everything else we've been talking about. So I know all of that information is on your webpage as well. So I'm going to do my best to help share it around and amplify it. And we'll certainly listen in when you're there. And I got no doubt the universe will help get it finished in the months ahead. So I look forward to listening. I ran out of questions. Was there any more?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add, and I don't even know if we talked about this, and it's not anywhere on my website, is the work I do around Indian hospitals. I don't know if we talked about this before, but so Edmonton was home to the second largest Indian hospital in Canada, the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, which is very much in central Edmonton, and served patients from northern Ontario, and all of the prairie provinces, BC, and all of the territories. And so patients from remote First Nations and Inuit communities were flown to Edmonton for medical treatment. The hospital closed officially in 1993, and patients were transferred here often without consent, often without advocates or loved ones who knew what was going on. And if they happened to pass away in Edmonton, their remains were not returned home, and their families were often not notified. So I've been working with individual communities, loved ones, nations who are trying to locate information about patients who were sent to Edmonton for treatment, and working very closely with the Nunavut Regional Corporation in the Northwest Territories. We've been able to locate and mark grave sites in 7 cemeteries here in Edmonton that were previously unknown and unmarked, and provide memorial services for their families. So I do that work as a volunteer, locating records and trying to find answers for people connected to the hospital here.
I think with all of the things that you're sharing, with all of these complex topics, it's for me, it's all still connecting with co-management, because unless people understand the layers of history and trauma and there's so many different multifaceted impacts that have happened, you truly can't really understand why things are so complex and hard to fix. And like you said, it's a generational thing. And I don't know what to say other than that the Confederacy and your community are really lucky to have you and to be doing this advocacy work. So I look forward to following along and seeing what's next.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved this conversation so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Cloudberry Connections. Each episode is engineered by Spencer Thompson, and we strive to keep making each episode better and more entertaining. But at the heart of this podcast, we really value the quality of our guests and all the expertise, knowledge that they have been willing to share. Please also visit comanagement.ca, where we continue to compile as many open access resources as possible about co-management in Canada. And until the next time we're together, please stay safe in peace and friendship. And remember that we are all treaty people in Canada, and we can all have an impact in reconciliation. Take care.